Okay, well, a preacher once told me that the 3 rules to preparing a sermon were talk about sin, talk about salvation, and talk about 15 minutes. So I'm not gonna preach, but I will try to keep it at 15 minutes. Today I'll be talking about the history of the U.S. Soil Survey, and I want to focus specifically on the racial politics of the survey. I think doing so is revealing not only for the historiography of U.S. science, which some people may or may not be interested in, but also for discussions like we're having here. So I'll try to make some connections to what soil care might mean and how it might be put into practice. So to provide some of the context, since I know everybody in here is not familiar with 20th century U.S. science and the history of U.S. science, I want to provide some context with quick reference to Liddell McWhorter's genealogy of Anglo-American oppression. She argues, quote, "The 19th century nation constructed itself as an organic entity of mythic proportion, a living tradition, a race," end quote. So it's important to realize that not only did this mythical organic entity transcend the individuals that composed it at any time, but also with the assimilation of evolutionary theory, quote, "the nation became not only a living being, but also an evolving being." So this informed a very particular kind of nationalist scientific racism that McWhorter reminds us enabled a narrative of Anglo-Saxon territorial expansion that made the founding population racially continuous with a national caste set in the northernmost regions of Europe. There was a nation, the Nordic nation. We're thinking about the fact that at this time the U.S. was still struggling to construct some sort of national identity. So for many white Americans, evolution dictated that eventually, quote, "Indians and the Negroes would be extinct. Nordics would populate as well as own and administer the entire territory," end quote. So this omnipresent talk that we hear, if you read early 20th century U.S. natural and social science, this omnipresent talk regarding improvement of the nation and the race, which might seem to suggest an inclusive community, for instance, the human race, were at root actually discussions about solidifying a white settler state. So again, to quote McWhorter, she says, "A better human race at this time for turn of the century U.S. power brokers simply was a whiter human race." And I think this is crucial context, and awareness of this tight linkage between racism, nationalism, and state science is necessary for understanding the genesis of the U.S. Soil Survey. And actually, I was in combination with Daniel's talk yesterday, it highlights the ways that care of the soil is oftentimes linked to a deeply conservative nationalism. So specifically in the U.S., to get to the specifics of the U.S. Soil Survey, it was founded in 1899, which was also the same year that the U.S. took control of the Philippines from Spain, not coincidentally. So this was a direct response to what I see as post-frontier anxieties about American manhood, white racial purity, and a mounting geopolitical competition. So when the 1890 census declared the frontier officially closed, it sparked intense concern about the future of the nation, because the process of westward territorial expansion that created and then ended the frontier was widely presumed to be the source of U.S. exceptionalism. So it's in this context that the founder of the Soil Survey argued for its necessity. Milton Whitney, the first director, reasoned in 1901, as you see here, as the nomadic life gave place to the sedentary life and the growing of crops, men needed more particular information. The selection of the land where they should settle became of supreme importance. So here Whitney is promoting a kind of universal view of history where society naturally progresses from these other modes of being, these other economic arrangements towards settled agriculture And in doing so, he's working to naturalize the survey as a necessary tool of human development, and also the settler state is naturalized here too. So here's Whitney. And just a brief outline of this early survey. I'm going to talk about the early survey and then another phase in the 1930s. So he guided the U.S. Soil Survey for the first several decades. And he believed that settlement must be administered by the state. This was one of the crucial roles of the Soil Survey for Whitney. It's important to look at some of this language for what it tells us about these framings. He argued that in order to secure the integrity of the nation, the material, the soil, must be understood and its use determined. This is one of his repeating themes. So he argued in all these really interesting theories and ways that the survey could be used to manage the nation. They should be used, first of all, to match particular crops to particular soils or regions. So for instance, tobacco should be grown in the region from Virginia up to Pennsylvania, and then other crops other places. This was also tied into what I was talking about in terms of geopolitical competition, right? He saw mounting economic global competition to be a real threat to the nation, as well as, so that was one of the external threats. There were also internal threats, and the survey could resolve them all. He also argued that the survey could be used to match laborers to regions, right? So particular laborers of particular racial qualities were seen to be better for certain crops, thus certain regions. So it was seen to manage both nature and society, if you will. Okay, so at the same time, we have Cyril Hopkins, who's also a really important soil scientist at the time, who was a relentless critic of Whitney's theories of soil fertility. And hopefully somebody here can correct me if I'm wrong, but my amateur reading of this is that today's soil science largely vindicates Hopkins' critique of Whitney, and we can talk about the specifics of that if anybody wants to later. And there's a fair amount of interest in these debates between Hopkins and Whitney and Dabney and other of the most important soil scientists in the U.S. at the time. But the literature focuses on these technical debates and actually obscures what I think is the most important common element, which is their white nationalism. So Hopkins also argued that without agriculture, America is nothing. Agriculture and the survey were central to the creation of nationalism, to the future of the nation. So we can also, and it was also very much a white nationalism. So Cyril Hopkins had his main concept or argument was for permanent agriculture. This is something that we still talk about, right? Whether it's in permaculture or whether it's in sustainable agriculture, whatever circles, this idea of permanent agriculture is really important. But this was rooted very firmly in his settler anxieties about belonging, right? That we needed as interlopers, as settlers, that white Americans needed to create a permanent society based in permanent agriculture, hence some of his writings, The Farm That Won't Wear Out, and also The Story of Soil, which is actually a work of fiction. It's actually a thinly veiled autobiography, but in this story of soil, Whitney actually tours the U.S. South, and he wants to buy a plantation. Hopkins, and he wants to be an aristocrat. He wants to rejuvenate the soil to turn this sort of collapsed plantation society back into a white permanent agricultural society. And he's talking to some planters and getting them to test their soils, and he tests the soil, and he's also courting one of the planters' daughters. And so in the wagon, they ride to town to test the soils in the wagon, and they are actually assaulted by black brutes who try to abduct the white woman, and he comes to their rescue and saves her, and they hang the black man, and everything is good, right? So this is what I mean by the sort of depth of these kinds of anxieties that we see in this moment. White masculinity is a threat, and soil science can save it and the future of the nation. So to get into some of the specifics of actually surveying and how it worked in this era, the surveys were actually really wide or large scale. So for instance, this is a 1906 survey of US national soils. So we see there are 14 types or 14 categories here. And so it's mostly used for national planning and speculative investing, right? So again, this is linked to Whitney's idea that we should plan crops for different regions, and also, of course, further capital accumulation through speculative land investment and secure land for white folks. So the text of the surveys prescribed best practices, and they did so by describing the practices of what they presumed were the best agriculturalists in the area. They often linked whiteness and agricultural modernization explicitly and in an exclusionary logic. So I have a quote here from the 1901 soil survey in Charleston, South Carolina area, where they're describing the best practices. Agriculture in the Charleston area is carried on principally by white planters of a high degree of intelligence, culture, and refinement. They are almost without exception in comfortable or affluent circumstances, sort of circular logic here, enjoying an ideal country life with time and opportunity for research and experimental work in agricultural lines, of which opportunity many of the foremost have availed themselves with much profit to the community. So we see here this kind of valorization of planters, of innovation, and of a specific kind of agriculture. This is not limited to this particular region. In the New Southwest, for instance, the text of the surveys argued that Europeans, in order to improve the soil, it required settling Europeans in the region. So this was not just about making the new territories legible after the close of the frontier, but actually specifically about the production of new forms of life, right? Both commercial crops and specific human communities, white patriarchal landholding families, or permanent settlement. So now I want to move into the New Deal era, the 1930s. And soil surveys are changed significantly here, but also there are some commonalities, so I want to explore those. Soils themselves were a crucial point of articulation between white nationalism and the New Deal. So we have this famous quote by FDR, again showing this linkage between the nation and the soil. The nation that destroys its soil destroys itself, right? And there's a lot to this quote. It's a very rich quote. Maybe we can get into it later. But I mainly just want to point out this linkage again between the soil and the nation, and the soil as living and providing life for the nation, which is itself a living entity. But the implication here is that one should care about soils because they are vital to the life of the nation, right? Also, in terms of governance, the surveys were base maps in a lot of ways for both soil conservation projects, which are crucial for the New Deal, and often these decentralized planning projects. So I want to talk a little bit about how this differs from the sort of top-down model that Whitney had, where the state determines where people should live and where laborers should go and where crops should be grown, to this sort of decentralized planning of the New Deal. Okay, so the surveys became much more detailed. They shifted away from, as I said, dictating the best crops for each region and actually towards cultivating individuals who were soil citizens, as we might want to think about it, who willingly absorbed state knowledge to safeguard natural resources, right? So this is what the surveys tried to do, was to create individual farmers who would look to the state for knowledge that ultimately was used for the state's ends, right? To protect natural resources, national resources. And this might appear more democratic on the surface than Whitney's vision, for instance. So we see here CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, trained black conservationists, as opposed to Whitney's vision, which was exclusive, racially exclusive. The Soil Conservation Society trained black surveyors and encouraged black farmers to conserve soil, actually actively including non-white folks into the soil programs, which had not been the case before. So it might appear on the surface more democratic, yet when we consider that the soil conservation programs also accelerated black land dispossession because of discriminatory allotment schemes, the picture is not quite so clear as simple notions of democracy or inclusion might suggest. So one way, and I think I would argue the most revealing way to think about this, is that essentially, in this case, black folks were used as infrastructure in a white nationalist project. So in short, the democratization of knowledge and inclusion in state projects did not lead to a significant leveling of power. It was, in fact, a mechanism for the reproduction of inequality itself. And I think this is an important lesson that resonates perhaps with what Christina said yesterday about the limits of efforts towards knowledge symmetry. So I just want to close here with a few thoughts so while the foundational logics of the soil survey relied on a racially exclusive nationalism, New Deal employed a relatively inclusive nationalism to similar ends. So we need to think about this, the limits of inclusion itself as a progressive notion. It must be accompanied with a redistribution of power. So for instance, this suggests the limits of citizen science. Knowledge and practices of soil management are also fundamentally biopolitical. They are about intervening in life. So this demands a rigorous political analysis, one that I argue must confront the logics of racial capitalism specifically. And then finally, colonizers have long had an interest in soil care, right? We see that if we look at colonial history around the world. One of the first things the colonizers did was try to study the soils and improve the soils. So this doesn't mean that we shouldn't care, of course, but, and I would argue, especially in this context, since this is a gathering of mostly Euro-American folks, we need to think more systematically about how our projects challenge and or reproduce this colonial history of soil care. So I'll just close there. Yes.
Thank you. I absolutely love this. It's a fantastic analysis. And it made me think of the book that I read by Paul Sutter, Lord in the Earth, where he posed the opposite. I just found it very interesting. Today you talk mainly about the expansion and the shock of when the expansion ends and you need to turn back to soil. And Paul Sutter describes the New England farmers who from the beginning, because they lived in a very highly populated area, sought to improve agriculture in situ and sought to improve soils in situ. And of course, this logic of seasons expansion west as a way forward for agriculture. And I was wondering what the soil survey data, how did that relate to that kind of a movement for agricultural conservation?
Okay, yeah, so there are all kinds of countervailing and contradictory tendencies within U.S. agriculture as a whole. So focusing on the soil survey at this time shows the logic of the state, right? And so there are all kinds of other people who are, or there are potentially other people who are trying to employ different logics, as you suggest, some who in different times and places were not necessarily following this expansionary logic of the state. Of course, the logic of the state and capital put lots of contradictions on what these farmers could and couldn't do, specifically the New England farmers, but all kinds of others as well. So, yeah, I don't mean to suggest that there was a sort of homogenous approach to agriculture at the time, but what was the specific question then about?
I was really just thinking out loud.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, right? That there is this, I'm focusing here on state logic, right? There, of course, is resistance to that, and different state logic wasn't sort of implemented uniformly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You said at the end that the colonizers were always very aware of the importance of the soil health of those they colonized. The reason was that they lost their soil in their own place, which was the case in England and France and Germany. End of 18th century, the worst time of soil health in the colonizing places. Do you see some of that connection between because one of the arguments of Commonwealth is that actually a large part of the agricultural knowledge was brought from the countries back to England, France, and Germany after the Indian and especially South American conquest. I mean, do you see some of that in the sciences of agriculture?
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely lots of exchange between the metropole and the colony, and lots of lessons learned in one place exported
to. But they exchange their own colonization back to the center, so to speak.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's not something that I necessarily have explored in this context, right? And this is a different kind of colonialism that I'm talking about in the late 19th, early 20th century U.S. is settler colonialism.
Right, but it is adding to injury, that in addition to destroying their own soil, then the soil of colonized, they brought back the sign of conservation to save the soil of France, Germany, and England, which is a great point by Commonwealth.
Yeah, that's one way to think about it, for sure. Yeah.
So, what is your view? You had the beginning and you had a transition in the New Deal, and where are we now?
Yeah,
in the US? I think specifically in my childhood in the Midwest in the 80s, when there was a financial crisis in farming, there's a depopulation of the region, for example. So I don't know if that's relevant or not, but just that, it makes me think, where are we at now?
In terms of the relationship between the survey and the nation?
I think the state and the land and the soil.
Yeah, that's a great question. In terms of contemporary U.S. soil surveys, it's not something that I have really gotten into a whole lot. I would like to in the future. So I'm eager to hear everyone, a lot of people in this room have a lot more practical experience with soil survey practices today. And so that's, so I look forward to further conversations about that for sure. I do still think there are plenty of problematic relationships between the state and environmental management that this suggests important themes for. Are we done?
Just one.
You are eating in Toronto.
Oh, yeah.
I was just going to add a comment to that. I flew across the Atlantic, and we always wake up at some earthly hour in the morning. So I watched TV, and there was an agriculture program. And the first item was the sod busting grant. The second item was implementation of soil conservation projects. You know, and it struck me, the one led to the other, and you know, so they weren't tied out basically.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Thank you.